Welcome to our esteemed speaker here today, who for at least 2 decades has proven herself to be a formidable intellectual force. And for me, as a young scholar, she really embodies what it is that we strive for when we want a resurgence in our nationhood and in our efforts to decolonize ourselves both intellectually, individually, and collectively. She has proven herself to be nothing short of a wrecking ball in our ongoing war of position against the forces of contemporary colonization and those critics of ours that would continue to see that play itself out in our individual and collective lives. Dr. Pam Palmater is a Mi'kmaq citizen and a member of the Eel River Bar First Nation in northern New Brunswick. She has been a practicing lawyer for 16 years and is currently an associate professor and chair of the Indigenous governance program at Ryerson University. She has 4 degrees, including a BA from St. Thomas in Native Studies, an LLB from University of UNB, where she won the Feskill Campbell Godfrey Prize in Natural Resources and Environmental Law. She went on to complete her master's and doctorate of law at Dalhousie University, specializing in Indigenous law. Pam has been studying and volunteering and working in First Nations and with First Nations issues for over 25 years on a wide range of social, political, and legal issues like poverty, housing, child and family services, treaty rights, education, and legislation impacting First Nations. She came in second in the Assembly of First Nations election for National Chief in 2012 and was one of the spokespeople, organizers, and public educators from which we are all grateful and know her probably the best during the uprisings of the Idle No More movement in 2012 and 13. Dr. Palmater's area of expertise is in Indigenous law, politics, and governance. She has numerous publications, including her excellent book, Beyond Blood, Rethinking Indigenous Identity, with Purich, I believe. And then, of course, her book that's on sale here today, and I compel all of you to purchase a copy and get her signature on it, Indigenous Nationhood, which, as Samir had mentioned, is derived from a collection of her social media and political writings over the last years. She is a well-known speaker, presenter, and educator on Indigenous issues, both Canada and, of course, internationally. So please help me in providing Pam with a warm welcome here today. Thank you. I'll also moderate Q&A, so keep it brief.
Never been called a wrecking ball. That's awesome. Kwe Nin Deluizi, Pam Palmater. Thank you to everyone for having me here, the organizers, my Musqueam sister for that beautiful song and her strong words, and for being on this territory. I'm coming from Mi'kmaq territory, and I bring all of my ancestors and all of our teachings and all of that good spirit with us, but I can tell from the energy in this room, this is going to be fun. You're okay if I push you a little bit, I think. And that's what I intend to do. I think it's long past the time that we start having real conversations based on the facts. And I think as long as we can always stick to the facts and make a plan for the future, then we can turn this whole ship around. The problem for most people, I think, is we get distracted by the noise. And it really is 90% of what you hear in the media and on TV and what's in newspapers and comments. It's all noise. It's all noise. And I think if we just get right down to it, deal with the hard facts, feel uncomfortable, and then we get to go to the good side, the good part, where everybody in this room gets to make the happy ending. So I'm a bit doom and gloom, but it's up to you to make the happy ending. And so that's the nice stuff. Here we go with the crisis part, because we are most definitely in a crisis. I don't know if this works here. Page down. How does this? Is there a technical person here? Or wait, maybe it's the arrows. Ah, there we go. Emphasis on crisis. And some of you may have heard me say this before, and some people might even think I'm overdoing it a little bit. But honestly, because of all of the noise, we don't get to see the crisis for what it is. And we are in a crisis of epic proportions, one that will impact the entire world if we soon don't get down to business. Canada has lost its way. I mean, that's very clear. It's been losing its way slowly, but in this last decade, Canada has clearly lost its way, primarily because Canada considers itself a nation. And that's extremely problematic, because Canada isn't a nation. Canada is a territory made up of many nations. But more important than that, more important than the people debating over who's in control of what territory, Canada is an ecosystem where all of the plants and animals, insects, birds, and fish are just as dependent on us as we are of them. Imagine if every time a mining company, when they applied for a permit, the map that you look at doesn't say Alberta or Manitoba. It says, oh, Mackenzie River Valley Basin. How's this going to impact this basin and all of the humans and plants and animals that depend on it? I think the questions that we asked, the cost-benefit analysis that we did, and the answers would be a lot different than what we have here today. If we don't address this crisis, if we don't find a way to reach one another, share all of the facts, find a way to weed out the noise and empower one another to take action in the many different ways that we can, we don't have a future. And it's as simple as that. This isn't just vote for me and I will give you favors, or, if you get an education, maybe you can have this job or that job. The crisis that's facing us is life and death for everybody. And we have an obligation here as treaty partners and nation-to-nation partners to do something about it. In fact, we have legal obligations from our own traditional Indigenous laws, but also from Canadian laws. We're not supposed to be harming one another. And the government was always about the people, and by the people and for the people. And there's a few people that have seemed to have forgotten that. They've forgotten that you're supposed to actually have the consent of the governed. It's a very core concept, even in Indigenous traditions. Never comes from the top down. And if we don't do this, if we don't address the three major crises that have all come to a head into one, we're in trouble. And the state of emergency really has to do with Canada is killing First Nations people. It's killing First Nations people. It has been, and it continues to do so. First Nations people are the defenders of the land. So in addition to killing Indigenous peoples, Canada is also destroying the land. And in doing those two things, and in order to do those two things, the only way that it can happen is if a few individuals in power take away all of your democratic rights and freedoms, because then you won't get to have a say about what's happening. So killing First Nations people, killing the environment, and then taking away your voice. That's how we've come to be where we are today. And that's what it is that we need to talk about. Doesn't seem to be... When I say Canada is killing our people, when I tweet on Twitter that racism kills, I'm not just talking about racism being annoying and hurtful and name-calling and ignorant. I'm saying that racism kills people. There are over 1,200 murdered and missing Indigenous women, and we know it's more than that. Because the RCMP admitted themselves, when they did this study, that the majority of victims they didn't have ethnic identities for. So 1,200 is all we know. We know it's worse than that. And in addition to that, we don't have numbers on the numbers of murdered and missing Indigenous men. Other countries have studies on how many Indigenous or Aboriginal men go murdered or missing or die in state custody. Canada doesn't. Canada doesn't take those numbers. It specifically doesn't note when Aboriginal people die in police custody. It makes it very difficult for us to even come before you and say, here's the facts, now let's do something about it. It's very convenient. It's hard to believe that in a country where crime is down, homicide rates are up just for Indigenous women. 16% of Indigenous women victims of homicide as compared to being only 4% of the population. That's pretty drastic. It means we have a problem. But what's worse is that everybody knows this now. The Native Women's Association of Canada brought it to the world's attention. The United Nations has, in no less than 7 reports, said, Canada, you have a problem here. You need to do an inquiry and take emergency action to stop it. Other countries like Mexico are saying, hey, Canada, what's up with you? You've been pointing fingers at us for a very long time about women that go murdered and missing. What are you doing in your territory? Deaths in state custody. It's something that's becoming an issue here in Canada. State custody meaning prisons, meaning foster care, meaning hospitals. Any place where Indigenous peoples are held against their will. This is something that we need to talk about. What about the deaths of our children in provincial foster care? It's pretty alarming. Or sitting in hospital waiting rooms like Brian Sinclair, where doctors and nurses walked by him for 2 days, where security guards refused to help him and he died of a preventable infection. That's racism that killed him. It wasn't the infection, and it wasn't a misdiagnosis. That's racism, and racism kills, and we need to talk about that. The number of deaths in provincial foster care is something we don't even have a full handle on yet. But what we do know is that 50% of all kids in foster care in the entire country, 50% are Indigenous, but only 4% of the population. And what's really disgusting is in Manitoba, 1 baby is taken away every single day. Every single day, 1 baby. 90% of all kids in care in Manitoba are Indigenous. Now, either the entire culture doesn't know how to raise babies, or we have a racism issue. And the simplest answer generally tends to be the truth. That's more damaging, more numbers than what happened in residential schools. 30,000 compared to the 11,000 in residential schools. This is why we need to change the conversation away from, why can't you just get over it, to why can't you just stop doing it? And that's what we're talking about here. This isn't a sad chapter in history. This is a horrific and scary and deadly reality for many people. And you only had to talk to anybody on the front lines, and I don't know more. And every single person I talked to was impacted by suicide, by kids in care, by losing a loved one and murdered or missing Indigenous women, and they still found the time to come out and say, Canadians, please work with us. Please stand beside us as nation-to-nation partners or treaty partners, and let's do something about this. Because as long as there's one First Nation person standing in this territory, there will always be someone to defend this territory and the people in it. We cannot risk anything happening to any more of our Indigenous peoples anywhere. But when we speak up, when we hunt and fish, when we defend ourselves, what happens? Well, we have yet another crisis overlapping on top of all of these other social crises. The number of Indigenous peoples in prisons or in state custody. Sadly, in the last decade, the number of Indigenous peoples in prisons has increased by 56%. 56%. For women, 90%. So imagine the corresponding impact on kids in care. If you have a 90% increase of moms, many of them single moms, going to prison, where do you think the kids go? And this is after the Supreme Court of Canada making a very specific plea to judges all across the country in the Gladue case, saying, we have got to stop this. We have a crisis. Stop putting Indigenous peoples in prison for things like poverty, for things like hunting and fishing, for doing things that we have treaty and Aboriginal rights to do, and for things that we have a moral thing to do, a moral right to do. In Stony Mountain in Manitoba, 65% of the inmates are Indigenous. 65%. So if you're not going to be swooped up into the murdered and missing category, or kids in care, or dying in state custody, or in prison, how many does that leave us? And how much more important is it that those of us who have managed to escape all of these atrocities now have to stand up and say something about it? Because those people in prison are just as much our brothers and sisters as our kids in care. And it's time everybody came together and said, we're going to take you home. We're bringing you home. You're on your way. It's going to take a little while, but you're on your way. We're bringing you home. Because without them, we don't have a future. And there's lots of reasons why. The amount of federal neglect that happens in our communities is palpable. I used to work for Justice Canada. One of their biggest portfolios, litigation and liability portfolios, was contaminated lands, contaminated housing, contaminated water, and lack of infrastructure. And how many successive years have gone on and they haven't dealt with it? The people in these pictures, one is from Saskatchewan, or Little Saskatchewan First Nation in Manitoba, and the bottom one's from the Navajo Nation. This isn't unique to Canada. They do the same things in the United States. They do the same things in Australia. That's why we're reaching out. 130 First Nations are under a boil water advisory at any one particular time, some of them more than 10 years. And if you don't think that this impacts you, where do you think the water flows? So if our water's contaminated, Canadian water will eventually be contaminated. What's happening to us is a sign of things to come for you. And for people who didn't believe that message early on, you just have to look at Bill C-51. Welcome to our world. This is what we've been dealing with. But we don't want you to have it. And we signed treaties with you to stand up for you and protect you. We told the Queen we will protect the settlers. And that's what we're doing. Until there's one last person left, we will be doing that. Imagine to learn from the American Medical Association and the Canadian Association of Medical Professionals and all of the research that they're doing that never gets advertised. You don't see their work in the media that says Indigenous peoples live 7 to 20 years less than Canadians from preventable conditions due almost exclusively to purposeful chronic underfunding. It's as simple as that. If you don't provide money for the infrastructure, for water and sanitation, it's simply not going to get done. The fact that we're in a situation where we have to rely on the federal government to provide that money, of course, comes from what? The failure to implement treaty rights, the failure to recognize our land rights, on which we have been self-sufficient since time immemorial. We wouldn't be having this conversation about funding if it wasn't all being held by one treaty partner. And that's what we're saying. We're saying it's time for that treaty partner to give back. You'll see a lot of studies, and this is what I'll say about noise, a lot of government studies, a lot of government media saying, oh, in the last 5 years, things have improved in education. Or, oh, in the last 3 years, look at how we're making improvements on neonatal health. But if you take all of the research over the last 25 years, you will see that all of the socioeconomic indicators have gotten worse. All of them. You can pick and choose a year here and there, but cumulatively, we're getting worse. How can that be? How can that be? The UN Rapporteur says that that's abysmal poverty in one of the world's most wealthiest nations. And that wealth comes directly from Indigenous territories. How could 4% of the population be literally starved off their territories when all they have left for territories are less than 0.1% of all the traditional lands they used to have? How is this possible? It's only possible because we allow it to happen. And we allow it to happen when we don't know what's happening. And you haven't been taught that in school, and good luck trying to get the facts from the media. But that's what this is about. When you know better, you can do better, because nobody wants this for any of us. We also have a historic and horrific legacy from residential schools. That's something that a lot more people are beginning to know about, but we still don't even know it all. And what has been Canada's response to the TRC Commission report? You couldn't have asked Justice Murray Sinclair, you couldn't have asked for a more thoughtful, kind, soft, gentle person to be heading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Had I been heading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, oh my goodness, Canada would be having a heart attack right now. So be thankful. Harper should be thankful he has someone so wise and experienced trying to share this truth with Canadians as gently as possible, but it's pretty hard to feel comfortable with death rates of upwards of 40%. It's pretty hard to feel comfortable with rapes and abortions happening to little girls in schools. You just can't get comfortable around that. Unless, of course, it's history. And then we have to ask how much of it is history. Are we learning anything different in schools today than what was being taught in residential schools, in public schools? Not a lot, probably. We have more kids in care today than we did during residential schools. All we're saying is stop. All we're telling Canada, and when I say Canada, I'm not talking about Canadians. I'm talking about the few people in power who have decision-making over this. You need to give them a different directive. Racist, colonial, oppressive laws and policies are ongoing. You only have to look at the Indian Act, 1876, and still going strong, in fact. Manages, controls, and dictates our life from birth to death. You can take kids away from us, put them in foster care, residential schools, but there's another way of taking kids away from their communities, by not registering them under the Indian Act, which doesn't allow them to be band members in the majority of First Nations. That's a form of ripping families apart. They can no longer go to First Nation schools, can't participate in the same events. Notice how the target almost always seems to be Indigenous women. Think of how many Indigenous women and little girls were forcibly sterilized. There's people my age who were forcibly sterilized without their knowledge and without their consent. Little girls 12 years old walk into the doctor with a sore stomach and come out sterilized. This happened, not just one or two people. Literally thousands of people. But I've never met a student in any one of my classes who knew that. Who knew that. At most, they know a little bit about residential schools. This is part of the uncomfortable truth that we have to deal with, why this is okay. But here's where I get political. Because despite what we know as fact, all of this stuff happened. We have a prime minister who tells the world we have no history of colonialism or any of the problems that went along with it. The same prime minister who allegedly apologized for residential schools very quickly forgot the next year that colonialism happened. And I try very hard most times not to be political. But he leaves me no choice. He who shall not be named leaves me no choice in the matter. We have to do something about this. How can our prime minister essentially erase that apology? How can our prime minister tell the world, murdered and missing Indigenous women? Not high on my radar. What message does that send to Canadians before you've even had a chance to even meet or get to know an Indigenous person? Why do we think that there is a culture of violence against Indigenous women and girls? Our own Prime Minister simply doesn't care. When I testified before the United Nations in Geneva this year, the Human Rights Committee member for Costa Rica got to ask Canada some very pointed questions. And one of them was, when are you going to deal with your culture of rape and violence against Indigenous women and little girls? And there was no response. And that's the status quo right now. They don't feel like they have to respond on any of these issues. Anytime there's an issue in the media, and I find it very difficult for Canadians to be able to be educated on any of these things simply by listening to the media, and not all media. But honest to goodness, every time there is a report about murdered and missing Indigenous women, about the housing crisis, about a water crisis, the very same day, what do you see in the media? I think there's a chief somewhere in the country that makes too much money. Every single time. Anyone in media studies can do it. I can predict on my BlackBerry phone here, because I'm old school. RCMP report comes out on murdered and missing Indigenous women. I will be called to appear on Power and Politics to debate the Canadian Taxpayers Federation on crooked chiefs and the need for accountability. What does this have to do? And I'm just going to lay this to rest now. If every single chief in this country made $1 million, and none of them do, that would be $633 million. It takes billions to sustain our communities. The chiefs are not the cause of our poverty. Okay, so now that that's to the side, we need to have the conversation about what really is. And there is tons of unoccupied Crown territory that could easily be recognized as Indigenous title territory, Indigenous unceded lands, or treaty territory. Even those First Nations, like in Manitoba, for example, that are under the treaty land entitlement, they signed an agreement where Canada said, we didn't give you the land that we said we would under this treaty process, so now we're going to guarantee you this land and we'll add it right away. They're still going to be waiting for decades to have that land added. And why is that? Because the longer they wait, the more they can take the minerals out of the ground and cut the trees and take all the fish and drain the lakes and install tailings ponds. But then they also have this really quirky program policy rule that says we don't add contaminated lands. You will have to remediate those lands before you get to add them to reserve. So then will we ever get to add our contaminated lands to reserve? That's why we're saying that this is extremely urgent. The United Nations is saying, act now, and that's not happening. And while we're killing off the land defenders, Canada's doing a really good job of killing off the environment at the same time. Now, this isn't going to be a tar sands lecture, but there's some really important things to know. If Alberta was a country, it would be the #1 country in the world for the highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions. The highest. That's not something anyone should be proud of. Poor Albertans. But worse yet, the First Nations that live there. It's the fastest growing source of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. The fastest growing, so as in expanding, not being managed. And it takes 4 times more greenhouse gas emissions just to produce the tar sands oil than it does regular crude oil. And we're still doing it. Why aren't we listening? We're certainly not listening to the plants and animals. We're not listening to Indigenous peoples who are saying, you know what, just slow down and wait a minute. Let's just see if there's another way that you can get what you want and we can protect the land at the same time. We're not even listening to the scientists. Even scientists that would be recognized by a Canadian government. The scientists who just recently said that if we are, as human beings, to avoid catastrophic climate change, we have to leave 99% of that oil in the tar sands. How many people feel very assured that that's going to happen? No, that's very scary to have someone say, hey, eat this, it's arsenic, you'll die, and you eat the arsenic. It's counterintuitive, even for human beings. All production has to stop by 2020. That's 5 years, less than 5 years now. All production has to stop. If not, then if the temperature increases by 2 degrees Celsius, that's all it takes for catastrophic climate change. But let's just say we leave the tar sands out of this for a minute, and we just talk about how we transport these hazardous substances around. Because we don't even do that right. Does anyone remember Lake Megantic? Does anyone remember the numbers? 6 million liters of oil into the lakes, rivers, farmlands, the city, every single water treatment plant that little city had. They're still suffering ongoing effects from that. And that's just the transportation of the substance. And we don't seem to learn our lesson. We keep thinking, we hear Keystone XL or Energy East saying, don't worry, we won't have any spills. We have top-notch technology. The problem is, you can have the best technology in the world, but if you don't do your work, if you don't do your maintenance, if you don't heed the warnings, if you're just simply neglectful because it's cheaper, then we will keep having these problems. Think about the scenario at Red Deer River, where Plains Midstream ignored every single of its own internal warnings, didn't do the maintenance, didn't do the monitoring, and ignored government warnings that said, you better check your pipe because we have a swelling river here and you have some issues with your pipe. And they didn't listen. So how much went into the environment? Millions. Millions. And I can say millions because in this particular case it was only 500,000. But this wasn't the only time Plains Midstream did this. In 2011, 4.5 million went into the environment at Peace River. Why do we keep approving people and companies and corporations in the extractive industry to keep doing what they clearly are not saying they're going to do? And who's paying for this? And when we did the cost-benefit analysis and said, we're going to get this many jobs and so many people are going to build houses here, did we build in the billions of dollars of remediation costs? Or are some of the taxpayers and Indigenous peoples on the hook for that? We even have to have different accounting when we're talking about these things. Because this wasn't just cleaned up and everything was okay. With every single spill, like look at Exxon Valdez, it took 25 years for those otters to recover. And I'm just picking on the otters. 3,000 died. Some of them suffered slow, painful deaths, and it took 25 years for them to make a comeback. And why? Because their entire territory, the otter territory, was full of oil. It was in the sediment, it was in the clams, it was in their fur. They were so obsessed with trying to clean their fur, some of them didn't eat and died. Because oily fur means you can't keep warm. Basic things that we're not thinking about. Otters have no choice if you fill them full of oil. But the problem with that is it's not just oil spills. People can say, okay, these are one-time events. This bird isn't from an oil spill. This bird is from a tailings pond. One of many that exist in Canada. One of thousands of birds that land in tailings ponds and die. Thousands, in fact. Just around the tar sands alone, there's been an 80% decline in the bird species population. And the wood caribou, 50% decline. So when they say that the impacts are local impacts just to the tar sand area, that's a lie. Their own studies have confirmed that. And here's what's gross. So think about how much time we have. The tailings ponds grow by 1.8 billion liters a day. That was yesterday, and the day before, and the day before, and the day before. And by the time you wake up tomorrow and think about this, another 1.8 billion liters. That's scary. And it really goes to show you how much time or how much time we don't have to sit around and think about it for a little while. Some of it, you can't remediate. In many areas, they just cover over the tailings ponds. Surely we can do better than that. But they say, well, the downstream is safe. Don't worry, it's safe. Well, I think you could find some Indigenous peoples there to say, we're not really into deformed fish. And Suncor did their own study. So you have to really like it when industry or government do their own studies and prove all of these facts themselves. Suncor did their own study and said that the moose meat First Nations people were eating was infected with 453 times the amount of acceptable arsenic levels. 453 times, and that's what our Indigenous brothers and sisters were eating. Government didn't like that and said, well, hey, let's do a new study. And so they said it's only 20 times the acceptable level. Well, you know, here we're talking about noise again. I don't care if it's 20 times or 100 times or 400 times. Beyond the acceptable level. None of it's acceptable. But we get distracted in, oh, see, you know, they're wrong. This is all just politics. This is trying to kill jobs. No, it's not. At the end of the day, we still have the same core facts. But we scoff at the scientists, and we scoff at these reports because they're in and out in the media. And most of the time, we just get little snippets, little headlines. We don't actually pick out the report and read it itself. Some of them are very scientific and full of jargon, and even I don't understand them. I have to have my science friends interpret it for me. So how are we as Canadians supposed to take all of this information and put it in one place? Because it's all related. I'm not giving 3 separate lectures on First Nations / and then the environment / and then our rights. All of this stuff is so intricately connected that you can't have one without the other. And the more we know that, the more we'll be able to make those changes. So forget about the scientists. Forget about what they have to say. What if we start listening just to the animals and the fish and the insects about what they're saying? And 12 orcas got caught in frozen seas with a little tiny breathing hole in a way that the Inuit said they have never seen. Orcas just don't ever get caught like that. They're a highly intelligent being. And why? Well, when they looked into it, they said because of climate change, they have to go so far into northern Arctic waters just to find food that they're beyond their territory and what they're familiar with. And then they got trapped there. Thank goodness these ones escaped eventually. but it was a pretty pathetic sight to watch the video of each of them taking turns in a little tiny breathing hole, knowing that if they don't get out of that, that's the end for them, 12 of them. But it's not just them. The Inuit have been saying this for a long time. What are the polar bears telling us? Well, we know the ice is receding. Look at the little tiny ice floes they have to hunt from now. The most recent science on polar bears says that if the ice breaks up 1 month early, and it may well next year, 73% of all polar bear pregnancies will fail. And that's in addition to the rising number of starving and drowning polar bears. Imagine polar bears drowning. Again, the Inuit are saying, we've never seen this in any of our lifetimes, polar bears just drowning, because there's not enough ice. But here's where the noise kicks in. Some scientists are saying, well, we have enough polar bears, we don't need to put them on an endangered list. You know, we're going to argue over how many numbers before they get to be protected. I think the endangered list is ridiculous. Every single one of the beings in our ecosystem need to be protected. At this point, how many of them are really safe? And some people would say, you know, they're all safe. This one probably scares me the most because I'm coastal. My nation is coastal. It's all of the Maritimes, the Mi'kmaq Nation. I have grown up on fish. The most recent science says if we continue at our current rate of overfishing and we don't change it, all the seafood that's currently fished for food will all be depleted in 35 years. And that report came out last year. So now it's 34 years. And that's pretty scary to me. Because we as humans, we could, in theory, give up eating fish if there's no more fish. But that's only if we're thinking about it from a human being and not an ecosystem scenario. What about the health of the ocean? What about the lack of biodiversity? What about the entire food chain that relies on all of these fish and little fish and even tinier fish? This is urgent. But you're lucky if you hear that in the media for one night, makes all the news, and then it's gone. And we don't hear about the polar bears until 3 months later. And it's making it really hard for us to pull all of this together and say, no, the crisis is far bigger than we're presenting it to be. And the overfishing is just part of the issue. That doesn't include how many fish will die from the pollutants or climate change. So then, you know, we have probably less than 34 years. And here's where more noise kicks in. There's a current debate amongst lawyers, accountants, and scientists, if you can imagine, no offense to myself, over how many species we're losing every year. Current science says it's around 10,000 species a year. Some lawyers beg to differ and say it's only 5,000. One, I have to question their credentials. And two, only 5,000? I don't care if they said it's only 100. How can we take any kind of comfort in saying, well, it's a lower number, that we're losing any of our species? One thing science does agree on is they have said that the extinction rate is far beyond natural, that it's 10,000 times the natural extinction rate, and it's 100% man-made cause. I don't think most people would take issue with that. There are some people who still think the world is flat. But in fact, all of these plants and animals, all of these fish are trying to give us a message. Even the insects are saying, you can't live without us even if you want to. I'd love to live without spiders. They creep me out. Or stingy things. But here's a real problem. And the numbers are really frightening. Last year, there was a 40% death rate in bee colonies in the United States. And everyone was like, oh, well, that's the US. Yeah, it was 30% in Canada. And maybe you don't like bees. 100 of the food crops that we rely on to provide 90% of our food, 71 of those are bee pollinated. Imagine what your grocery store would look like, or even your traditional foods, without these bees, and if we can't find a way to bring them back. Even things like alfalfa hay that's fed to cows, it's pollinated by bees. Where will we get all of our hamburgers? That's significant. The majority of our food is pollinated by bees, and our bees are dying. And there's people in the media, tons of people talking and debating, more lawyers and accountants, more politicians saying, well, we just don't know why. Meanwhile, on the side, you have scientists saying, oh, we'll tell you why. It's all of these pesticides. It's the fact that you're getting rid of all of the flowering plants alongside of roads and highways to make it look better. And bees don't have enough food. So if you're not killing them with pesticides, they're starving to death. If you starve them, they starve you. Not because they want to. What bigger of a sign could you get than the bees dying? And that's one of the ones that actually worry me the most. And the thing is that we don't have to be doing all the things that we're doing. Sometimes we're led to believe, well, we have to cut down trees to build our homes. Okay, I'll give you that one. But we don't have to clear cut the trees to save a little bit of money. Because here's the really irrational thing about it. We have the tar sands and other activities like that contributing greenhouse gases. But the earth lungs, which just happen to be the trees, absorb greenhouse gases. So why don't we just increase greenhouse gases and kill our lungs at the same time? And then aside from that, I'm very offended as an Indigenous person that a company would do this to one of our grandfather mountains, which sustains so much life, which have their own spirits within them, when you don't have to. And here, here's what really upsets me. I went through school and I learned about a little bit about environmental stuff and geology and geography and all of these things, and I was told in the old days they used to clear cut. And we learned that that wasn't environmentally sound, and we don't do those practices anymore. We have what's called responsible forestry management practices. Well, here's the counterfact. 90% of all logging done in Canada's boreal forest, 90% is still done by way of clear cutting. 90%. So who's doing this forestry management stuff? And how is anyone here supposed to know about it? Because here's the thing that gets me. I wish I could just look at Canadians and say it's all your fault. But when they clear cut like this, so that you can drive along any highway in this country and see nothing but beautiful trees, there's nothing alarming in that. Unless you walk 2 trees deep into the forest and you see there's vast expanses of nothingness, just deadness all around. People who have nothing to hide nothing. So if you have to hide this, someone knows this isn't right. And there are hundreds of photos like this all over the country where we have very beautiful highways, great for driving in tourists, horrible for the environment, horrible for lots of reasons, not just because you're killing the trees and the earth's lungs. All of that sediment goes into lakes and rivers and streams and kills fish, destroys habitats for no reason. There's 62 different ways to log? Do we have to pick the clear cutting? And that's your choice. You have to tell your governments, no, that's not cool. There's another way to do it. And there is, and science will back you up. The UN has been calling the situation with water in the world a crisis for over a decade. A crisis. And how many times do we hear about this in this country? Not a lot. So NASA said, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do some very sophisticated investigative techniques, and we're going to monitor 37 of the world's largest underground aquifers that supply the majority of the world's population with fresh drinking water. 21 of those 37 have already gone past their tipping point. That means it's not being replenished at the same rate that it's being used. They're already past their tipping point. We can't do anything about that 21. Wow, we better protect the rest and stop polluting the surface water. These are pretty incredible things. And then imagine if you can sell 1 million liters of water to Nestle for $1. Really, when First Nations don't have clean water to drink, we can do that in Canada. These are all decisions we don't have to accept. It's like someone's not listening to any of the signs. It's like he doesn't understand what's going on. Because the response hasn't been, oh my goodness, we better do something about this. The response hasn't been, let's join with First Nations who are trying to defend the lands and waters from like hydrofracking and tar sands and Keystone Pipeline and all of these things. No. What has the response been? That has been the response for us for a very long time. And coming from the Mi'kmaq Nation, we've had many of these relationships. This is what happens when you stand up against hydrofracking in New Brunswick. But it wasn't just the Mi'kmaq. And nobody in the media reported that. We were there for 4 months, peacefully doing ceremonies and protecting the land from hydrofracking for 4 months. They waited until the RCMP SWAT team came in and a bunch of cars started burning. Because, wow, that'll scare everybody here. You don't want to join with First Nations people. But boy, they miscalculated the scenario. Because here's a success story. New Brunswickers had the same concerns about hydrofracking and polluting your drinking water. They stood beside the Mi'kmaq people, even when the SWAT teams were there, even when snipers were pointed on people. And the government said, there, we showed them. We made a whole bunch of arrests. We showed them. And then what did New Brunswickers do? They voted out that government. And the number one issue was their failure to take New Brunswickers' concerns about hydrofracking into account. They have the power to do it. You have the power to do it. And that's what I'm saying. It's not as difficult. It's not as overwhelming as it seems. We can do this. Right now, there's a very bad image of Indigenous peoples, that we're violent and that we're militant and we wear camo and we're very dangerous. I purposely wear camo. The day the military walked into Mohawk territory and the Canadian military turned on Indigenous peoples, I said, I'm going to wear camo all the time and say, you don't intimidate me. But I buy it from Le Chateau to make a point. Because how dangerous is Le Chateau? So for all the times that they called me the top 5 to fear, militant and radical, camo wearing, nut bar, really, there's a lot of people wearing camo right now. But it makes a point. It's very scary and intimidating for the military to treat us like this when time after time after time, what are we armed with? Our drums, our medicine, our women, our children, our elders. There is an injunction out against me right now by Hudbay Mining Corporation because I cooked fish in Cree territory with the Cree. They testified in court that that was intimidating. They were scared for their lives. And it could have caused someone's life to be harmed. They even had the RCMP make this testimony. So now I have an injunction. I'm not allowed to go to that part of Cree territory and cook fish anymore. But here's the thing. I'm not just saying, here's what's happening to Indigenous peoples. This has always been happening to us. There were scalping laws on Mi'kmaq people since the day of contact. What I'm saying is, it's coming to you, and it already has. Look at the G20 summit in Toronto, a big, wealthy, fancy city. And look at how many people were beaten and violated against their will. Disabled people, elderly people, people who were just walking around downtown, who had nothing to do with this. They were herded like cattle, and they're still trying to address these issues. That's when I say, welcome to our world. It's not just a First Nation issue anymore. If we let this continue, this is your world too. What about the student protests in Quebec? Honestly, student protests? How dangerous. Not a single one of them was armed. That's an embarrassment. Those are the things that Canada has traditionally looked at other countries and said, oh, can you believe they did that to their students? Can you believe they would bring out the police and the SWAT team and the army? No, I can't believe other countries would do that, or Canada, to students. Honestly, we're trying to raise our students to be active. In the 70s, that used to be cool. Now it can get us killed, and that's how far we've come. Since when has being a tree hugger anything been more benign than a hippie or an earthy person? Now it makes you a terrorist. This is what you're facing if you say, hey, I don't like what's happening at my university. Really? And that's okay with the rest of us? Since when have the RCMP and the military become free security forces for industry? They are there to protect our interests. When we were cooking fish in Cree territory, we called the RCMP and said, listen, we're going to be going and cooking fish in Cree territory. We've heard that Hudbay gang rapes Indigenous women in Guatemala and kills their leaders. We've heard that they do the same thing in Peru. We're a little nervous about what might happen by Hudbay. Can you come and protect us? And the RCMP came, and they had fish with us. Some of them wore I don't know more stickers. We got pictures taken together until we showed up in court, and the police said, yes, they were being intimidating, they were frightening, they were being militant, they should be locked up or at least get an injunction on them. And the world is distorted that way. So what's our response to this? And here's where I'm getting into the demolishment of Canadian rights, liberties, and freedoms. Because the only way to address radicals like David Suzuki are to really just take the environment out of the conversation, take Indigenous peoples out of the conversation. And one of the worst environmental disasters to ever happen to this country is he who shall not be named, who literally destroyed the Kyoto Accord. The only country that said, you know what, we're not going to reduce our emissions, and that's going to cost us about $14 billion in penalties, which we agreed to pay if we didn't reduce our emissions, so we're just going to get out of this. I don't remember him talking to any Canadian. I don't remember him doing any consultations or talking to Canadians or First Nations people about whether we would want that to happen. So we have had a decade-long disaster. But then it gets worse, because then he gets reelected. And now we have a giant bunch of omnibus bills like Bill C-38, which literally gutted the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, all of the Canadian environmental assessment processes. Now it's up to them to decide which projects have to do an assessment. And if they don't like the assessment, Cabinet can overrule it. Very little public consultation, and stupid things like we're going to increase the amount of permits a company can get to dump human waste into the oceans. Used to be only 1 year. Now you can just keep getting renewable permits. For what purpose? But it wasn't just that bill. No, because we had to have Bill C-45. Because Bill C-45 said, yeah, the 2 million lakes and 8,500 rivers that we have here in this country, no more protection. It's now a free-for-all. And transportation won't be regulated on any of those lakes and rivers either, except for 1%. But here's the thing, the province doesn't have jurisdiction over transportation. So now we have this legislative void. The way I see it, Indigenous people should move in, occupy that field and say, if you can't do your job, we're going to do that job. Because the job you're doing sucks right now anyway. But in a way, I kind of have to thank him for Bill C-45, because eventually that bill will be trashed. It's already in the courts. I already won a lower court case for not consulting with Indigenous peoples. I think someday we'll be able to trash it. But here's why I celebrate it. Because it brought us all together. Finally, we were able to talk to one another, share with one another, stand beside one another, and say, you know what, this fight isn't between us. It never was. It was behind those colonial few people in power in government, people making really stupid political decisions. But the people on the ground, it was never between us, and organically sprung up. Tens of thousands of Canadians and First Nations peoples literally danced in the street and said, you can't do this anymore. That's wonderful. But it was also predicted. I don't know if anyone knows Tom Flanagan. He wrote a security report for Harper that said the worst, and I quote, nightmare scenario that could possibly happen in this country would be if First Nations people got together with environmentalists. And look at what happened with Idle No More. Not only did First Nations people and environmentalists get together, so did teachers and professors and unions and single moms and single dads and church groups all over the country said, wow, this is not good on a whole bunch of reasons. And we agreed to set aside our differences. You don't have to agree with Aboriginal and treaty rights. You don't have to, and I don't have to agree with all the ways in which Canada is structured. That's not the fight that we're having. The fight that we're having right now is to protect our lives, our environment, and our freedoms. And we can go back to fighting later. But we have a current issue before us. And so Tom Flanagan was wrong. Not only was he wrong because it would be a nightmare scenario, he was wrong because he said violence would ensue. Violence of epic proportions. And in fact, Harper adjusted his throne speech to address this apocalyptic nightmare that was supposed to be coming. His throne speech was all about, we will not let economic terrorism happen in this country. We're going to give more money to the police and infrastructure to protect those resources, and we will extract them. That was the very clear indication about Bill C-51 to come. Because this nightmare turned out to be the most beautiful thing that ever happened in this country. So how do you stop that? The only way you can stop it is to enact something called Bill C-51 and create a new national security law where a threat to sovereignty, a threat to economic situation, a threat to infrastructure, a threat to diplomatic relations. All of these things are now terrorist activities. They have legalized what they've been doing illegally for many decades. They have the right to monitor, surveil you in any way they want to, put you in jail, detain you, and treat you as a terrorist. If you interfere with economic or financial conditions in Canada, well, every time we had a protest in Hud Bay, their stocks prices went down. Pre-51, that was awesome. Post-51, that's potential terrorist activity. And that's not cool. If you do an analysis of Bill C-51, which was another omnibus bill, every single right that's contained in the charter is impacted. It's pretty scary. And people think, well, I'm not going to protest, it doesn't impact me. You don't have to protest. You can have a private conversation with your neighbor about how Canada shouldn't be selling resources to China. And that's terrorist activity. You can look up on your internet information about what's happening with ISIS. And now they're allowed to monitor your computer. You don't have to be in the streets to be impacted now. They're even targeting bird watchers. Imagine targeting bird watchers. The only bird watchers I know are very elderly, wonderful people. I almost want to go outfit them all in camo and say, now it's justified. So what did Bill C-51 do? It turned people like one of my heroes, David Suzuki, into a terrorist, alongside of First Nations who have long been painted as terrorists. But did you ever notice that not a single protest anywhere that we've ever had in the country, we've said, we're protesting because we want more seats in cabinet, or because we want to sit on your corporate board, or because we want you to give us $5 billion. It's never been about that. It's about, please don't take away this land that we have left. Please don't poison the water. Please don't strip mine. Please don't clear these trees. Please don't put a pipeline in my fish habitat. Those seem pretty reasonable things to me. But if none of this convinces you, if none of these signs bring home to you that there's a crisis, then I think you should listen to man's best friend, because the animals are taking action. And there's a very clear sign here. If this poor puppy can risk his life for us, I think we have to do that. So what do we do about all of this? There's a lot of things we do, and the first thing that we have to do is stop Harper. Okay, this last decade is thank you, Mr. Harper. And I'm not a member of any political party in federal or provincial governments. I'm nonpartisan. But I can see a deadly force in our country. And we need to stop it now. We need to stop it now. But here's another thing. Here's how we stop it. Not just Harper, but any successive government from doing this to us ever again. We confront them with a sword and shield. First Nations people are the shield. And you know why? Because Harper can enact any law he wants to. He can repeal any law he wants to. But there's one thing that he can't unilaterally amend, and that's the Constitution. And right now, there's something in the Constitution called Section 35. And it says you cannot unilaterally extinguish Aboriginal and treaty rights. And the Supreme Court of Canada says, oh, and on top of that, you have to consult, accommodate, and sometimes get consent. And then the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which the majority of states around the world signed on to, also says, yeah, it's about free, informed, and prior consent. And yes, that means a veto. But who would you trust with your water and land and plants and animals? The only people with good track records here certainly aren't the corporations. It's not Harper. I think First Nations, with the fewest amount of resources, are our best shot at saving the plants and animals and waters for our future generations. Because here's the thing. If there is no farmable land or drinkable water in this country, it's not just First Nations that die, it's everybody. Everybody. And that's pretty important. And we have the law behind us, not in the ways, all the ways that we want it, but we have the law behind us. We have that shield. And then think about it from another perspective. If you were going into war, let's just pretend I'm at war with Harper. Or don't pretend. Think about this. Who would you rather have on your side? Anyone in the world. Indigenous peoples have survived scalping, sterilization, residential schools, murder missing Indigenous women, imprisonment, threats, terror tactics, forcible starvation, theft of all of our lands and resources, and we're still here saying, we just want to work with you, Canadians. Just be our treaty partners. Just stand beside us. All we want to do is forgive. Idle No More was all about that peace and friendship. It oozed the essence of the treaty and the nation-to-nation relationship for people that don't have treaties. I wouldn't want to have anybody else on my side than a group of people who are as strong and resilient and forgiving and loving and protective of this territory as I am. But you don't have to listen to me, because people far more famous than me, like, say, David Suzuki, told all Canadians, listen, it's not environmentalists that are going to save Canada or the world. It's Indigenous peoples. And you know why? Because they have tens of thousands of years of traditional Indigenous knowledge of how to live here and maintain here and keep us healthy. No science in the world has that, because only we've been here since time immemorial. And then if you don't believe him, say you're of a different religious persuasion, well, the Pope has something to say about that too, and he has a pretty big following. And he said, here's why it's Indigenous peoples that will save the world. Because they don't look at the fish and the water and the land as capital commodities. They are attached to their land. And as we've seen, some of us have died to protect this land. Wow, those are the people I want fighting on my side. And then think about it. When you went to war, when it was very scary and you went to all of these world wars, who were the first people to sign up? Indigenous peoples. Why? Because they signed treaties with the Queen that said, we will protect your settlers and this territory. And we've lived up to our treaty obligations, and we still live up to them. We're still trying to live in peace and friendship. But man, it's time we need some help. And Idle No More, I think, was really the start of a new relationship. Because in the end, you can't fight a war with a shield. You need the sword to go with it. And you are all the sword. And here's why. You have the numbers, you have the wealth, the power, the influence, the access. It's your system. It's your voting system. You could show up on October 19th in historic, unprecedented numbers and get rid of the dictator and start all over again. You have the power to do that. Or whoever gets in, you can say, this is not how our Canada is going to go. So imagine if you put those two things together. We've got the shield to stop complete and utter destruction, and you have the sword to make sure it changes. We can't be stopped. We showed that in New Brunswick. We couldn't be stopped. We kicked out a whole government that threatened to pollute our lands. And we don't need new solutions. The solutions have already been there in our nation-to-nation relationships or our treaties. Because our treaties, no matter what they say, most of them are pretty simple. Mutual protection, mutual benefit, and mutual respect. You can go forward and create any kind of country or territory or ecosystem protection scenario that you want with those three things. We promised to help you, and we did. Now we have some murdered and missing Indigenous women. We have some kids in care. It's time for Canadians to say, you know what, that's not cool. That's not good anymore. And if none of that convinces you, I think you'll be hard-pressed to say no to this. If you don't do it for you, or do it for me, or do it for your mother, or your boyfriend, or your wife, do it for our kids. Some of the kids that you haven't even had yet, if our fish are gone in 35 years. For us, it's 7 generations down the road. Oh my goodness, if I can't take care of this generation coming up, there won't be a 7th generation. And I have an obligation. I'm not acting as a Mi'kmaq person. I'm not acting as a good treaty partner if I don't continually fight to defend our futures. And there's a multitude of ways that you can do that, and you can choose which ways. They don't all cost money. I'm just asking that you now take this, go out, educate, and empower other people, and do something. Do something so that we don't have any of these things come to fruition. And we can do it. We have done it. And Idle No More showed us we don't need billions of dollars to do it. The poorest people in this country and the wealthiest people in this country can get together and make a difference. So I hope that you will do this with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. So we'll take a few questions. We've got about 15 minutes, so I'll moderate. Just please try and keep your questions on point so we can get more people up and have the opportunity to chat. Oh, there's a microphone here.
The AFN chief, Perry Bellegarde, initially said he would not vote in the federal election. Now he's changed his mind. I think I've also heard you say that you don't vote in federal or provincial elections, if that's correct. Have you changed your mind?
No, I don't flip-flop. But here's the other thing. Really, that's just a distraction. It doesn't matter if I vote, doesn't matter if Perry votes. All that matters is that every single Canadian votes. We can't get distracted by the debates. That's what they want. I mean, look at through this whole pre-election period so far, what has anyone talked about? Are Indigenous peoples going to vote or not? We should be talking about all of these crises instead of getting weighed down into politics. So I don't vote because for me, I want to put all my energy into educating and encouraging and in partnering. That's where I think my voice can be best exercised. But a large number of Indigenous peoples are going to vote, even those who don't believe in it, because unlike any election in history, we're facing a crisis and they want to get Harper out. But that debate is really secondary to what we need to do to go forward.
Well, what if this thing is not about Harper only? What if it's about anyone who comes in his place? What if the corporations are those who are leading to this genocide? What will we wait another 4 years to say stop Mulcair or stop Trudeau? Is there a political solution to this? Or should we stop the corporations? Should we stop the puppeteers or the puppets?
That's a really good point, because here's the thing. The genocide of Indigenous peoples and the colonization and oppression has been going on for decades. Every government, Liberal, NDP, and Conservative, have had a hand in it. I will be the first to admit that. Look at Trudeau, and he wanted his white paper, and the NDP government currently serving in Manitoba, which has the worst murder to missing rates and child and family services rates. But what we do have that's very unique is a prime minister that doesn't follow the law, doesn't follow democratic processes, and there is no relationship right now with First Nations. He doesn't talk to them, not even Perry Bellegarde. There is no talking, no negotiating. So we no longer have a government that doesn't talk to its citizens or First Nations. We need to get rid of the non-government, put a government back in there, and start over. And so help me, if they don't do it, then I'll be even worse that time around, because everybody's making lots of election promises. But here's the thing about politicians. Don't just settle for, I'm going to improve nation-to-nation relationships. I'm going to, talk about treaties. No, I want specifics. Are you going to repeal Bill C-51? Are you going to repeal C-45? Are you going to have a national inquiry? Are you going to do all these things? And when? And how long? And for what purpose? Be specific. But it's not just voting that's going to do this. We have to use the courts, we have to use action on the ground, we have to use the United Nations, we have to use every venue open to us, Because my greatest fear is, let's just say we vote out Harper and everyone goes, oh, okay, everything's good now. Because this environmental destruction isn't going to stop just because we vote him out. But I think we have a better chance at it if we do.
Thank you for your impassioned comments and and thank you for your fight, right? The fact that you're willing to stand up for it. It's a question similar in vein, but I'm thinking internationally. What about international actors that are now like pushing the political hand? That now our political actors are the puppets, because now it's literally corporations that are suing, nations and saying, "Oh no, you can't change your environmental laws." So, and I know there's a lot of like worldwide indigeneity fighting for this. So how do we add to that kind of fight on an international scale where we ourselves are losing our democracies and our sovereignty? Like funny enough, those who are not Indigenous are now going through the exact same process that Indigenous people did.
Anything anybody can do to help at any level actually helps. On the international level, Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples are working at multiple forums. I was in Geneva working primarily on these trans-country type or multiple country type corporations who just go in and mine and pillage, and we were fighting Canada along the way. So I think all we need to do is turn the tables. Right now, Canada monitors everything we do and tries to counter everything we do. They've never had that much resistance at the international level, but now we follow them around everywhere. And every time they testify and say, oh, no, our Canadian mining companies follow the law, we can say, actually, no, you don't. And here's all the reasons in which you don't. So the more we inform the United Nations, the better. Because with or without Canada, the member states can change the law. And we have the majority of the member states on side. And just 4 countries don't control it. As much as they'd like to think they do, times are changing all over the world, and we can do it. We just need help from people with all different skills. Some people are great at social media, but some people are researchers. Some people are international lawyers. Anybody who wants to help in that capacity. And you have the numbers. That's the thing. There's only so many of us. But Canadians have the numbers. We can do it.
Thank you. I'm a brand new Canadian and trying to understand the lay of the land here. So I've been reading, and one of the things I read recently is this government published a position paper on the renegotiation of treaties. And it's a really, really interesting document. The preamble is lovely, but when you read the document, it's a very, very strategically brilliant document that puts principles of reconciliation in terms of mutual exploitation of resources. As a lawyer, how can untreated First Nations who have nation-to-nation negotiating status, how can they even begin to negotiate in the context of the new framework for treaty negotiation when the two systems, the two worldviews are speaking past each other so thoroughly?
They don't have to negotiate under Canada's process. And probably one of the most important things Indigenous people can do is actually not participate in processes that are harmful to them. We don't have to take what's given to us. Harper's not going to be the last prime minister. We don't have to settle all of this right now. This whole situation took 500 years to create. Maybe we have to wait another decade before we start talking. Maybe we have to wait for a government that's willing to start talking, or we just do it. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples said we don't need Canada's okay to just do it. And the Mohawks are a fine example of just doing it in many scenarios. And I think they have a lot to teach us about sovereignty and jurisdiction and what that means. I will say, having worked for Justice Canada, there's a code in everything that the government writes. And they can trick you into making it sound really good. But it doesn't say what you think it says. So when they say, we will guarantee the protections, that's not guaranteeing the rights. That's guaranteeing the wording that allegedly protects the rights and things like that. You need a fine-tooth comb to go through anything that they write but we do it. And that's what we try to do. That's what I tried to do in my book. Every time they put a law out that said, hey, here's the Safe Drinking Water Act. Oh, it has nothing to do with safe drinking water. It's about transferring all of the legal liability to First Nations so that they can't get sued. But we need to look through all of these laws and policies and decode it. Because to average Canadians, it would look like, this is great. Gender Equity Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Family Homes on Reserve Act. These things sound wonderful. And they're not. They're garbage. They're Trojan horses, in my legal opinion.
Thank you so much for this. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the role of the arts and artists in this struggle and in building relationships between our peoples.
I think they serve one of the most important functions because we have to find a way that people can access this information. That's why I generally don't stand up here and do a legal lecture. This judge said this in this court case and this date and that, because that's good for a law school, but it's generally not good for the public. It's why I try to avoid legalese and jargon and all of those things, but artists have a way of showing people what's happening without words in a way that's impactful. Like one of my sons looked at one of the pictures of the bears up there with the 10,000 species. When I told him, oh, did you know there's 10,000 species? It didn't hit him until he saw the picture of the bears. And he's like, could they be one of them? It's like, yeah. So people are auditory and visual and emotional and spiritual and connected, and I think artists can help us reach everybody.
Hello, I'm from Alberta. I'm First Nations from northern Alberta. And I grew up in a place that was, one or the other. And I was raised in an adoptive family. So thank you for acknowledging that struggle. My question is, what would you say to someone, because I grew up with two very conservative parents, like how do you, like in a short, because I know this encompasses it, but I don't usually have an hour to explain it to everybody. So like what's a small, short sort of dialogue you could have with someone who's against everything you just said?
I do it one fact at a time. So each conversation starts with something like, hey, why don't you people just get over it? Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. You know how residential schools, and they took 11,000, well, now it's 30,000, so that's hard to get over. Or the other conversation in a coffee shop. Hey, are you Pam Palmater? Are you the one that stands up for all those crooked chiefs? Oh, sorry, why do you think they're crooked? Well, they all make millions of dollars. Well, let's have a conversation. Municipal librarians make six-figure salaries and they manage books. The average chief and counselor makes less than $36,000, less than the average Canadian, and they manage people's lives. When you start talking facts, you can win any debate, but you can also enlighten people. Because not all the students that sign up in my class sign up because they think, hey, this is cool, I'm going to find out what she has to learn. Some people are in combat mode. I'm Tom Flanagan's cousin, and we're going to head this on. And facts win out by the end of the year. The vast majority of people can't argue with the facts. And I leave all the political stuff out of it. It's not about liberal or this or that or whatever. It's literally about the facts and what do we do about it, and shouldn't we care as human beings? But good on you for long road for some. And here's the other thing. Don't get discouraged, because you don't need everyone to join the revolution. No revolution in history had the entire population. In fact, they had a very small part of the population. But there's this magical thing about people doing magical things. After a while, other people want to follow. And so you just do your thing and don't worry and just ignore the negative. Imagine I'm on social media, how much negative I would get. block, 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 and I never pass it forward. So every time Ezra Levant says, oh, that militant nutbar, why would I pass that forward? Why hurt other people? Focus on the positive, get our messages out, and just eliminate all the noise. Because not everyone's going to agree, and that's okay.
Well, thank you, Pam. Pam has been kindly agreed to spend some time at the back table, so if you want to introduce or if you have any further questions, she'll 15 minutes, I think, of signing books and just kind of meet and greet.